Bless her heart, doing a cook's work well past the age most girls find husbands. Some women are simply built for service, not for marrying. Lavinia Ashby said it the way she said everything cruel, smiling, over a teacup, to a porch full of women who all laughed a half-second too late. Hattie Sutter was 30 feet away at the well, and she heard every word, and she did not set down her bucket, and she did not turn around. But 3 days later, the tallest man in the county would stand up in front of the entire town and answer that sentence, out loud, in a way nobody in Millbrook Flats would ever forget. To understand why he did it, you have to go back to the winter before, to a cookhouse door, and to 6 Sunday mornings nobody was supposed to know about. If you've ever felt like the world walked right past you without once looking up, like you did the work and somebody else got the thanks, you already know Hattie Sutter. Stay with her story to the end, because what happens to her is going to happen slow and quiet, and then all at once. If you're watching from somewhere you love, drop your town in the comments below, and if this is the kind of story that feels like home to you, go ahead and subscribe, because there's more waiting for you here. Now let's go back to Millbrook Flats, Colorado Territory, the autumn of 1883, to where it all began. The Kincaid Ranch cookhouse smelled of wood smoke and scalded milk before the sun was even a rumor over the eastern ridge, and that was exactly how Hattie Sutter liked it. She had been the ranch cook for 6 years, since she was 25, and her father's heart gave out in a hayfield and left her mother too frail to work, and a mortgage too large to ignore. 6 years of 4:30 mornings. 6 years of hauling 40-pound sacks of flour on her hip, like other women carried parasols. Her arms had gone thick and strong from kneading bread for 30 hands twice a day, her shoulders broad from splitting kindling when the stable boys were too slow, her face round and flushed from standing over stove fires in July. She was a big woman, built like the work she did, and she had long ago stopped waiting for anyone to say it kindly. She had come to Millbrook Flats as a girl of 11, when her father staked his claim on the 6 acres that would later carry his mortgage, and, eventually, his name on a headstone in the churchyard behind the schoolhouse. She remembered a childhood of thin winters and her mother's careful stretching of every sack of cornmeal, and she remembered, more than anything, the particular ache of being a large girl in a town where the other girls were slight and pretty and got asked to dance at the harvest socials, while she stood along the wall pouring cider for people who never quite looked at her, while they took the cup from her hand. She had made her peace with that particular invisibility a long time before she ever set foot in the Kincaid cookhouse, had decided, sometime in her early 20s, that if the town would not see her as a woman worth noticing, she would at least make herself a woman worth needing, and there was no ranch within 50 miles that didn't need a cook who never burned the beans and never let a man go home hungry. Nobody at the Kincaid Ranch ever mocked her to her face. Garrett Kincaid did not allow unkindness under his roof, spoken or otherwise, though he rarely said so. He simply looked at a man until the man understood, and Garrett Kincaid's look carried weight, because Garrett Kincaid was the largest rancher in 3 counties in every sense of the word. He stood a full head above any man who worked for him, shoulders like a doorway, hands that could crush a tin cup without trying. Cowboys who'd worked cattle from Texas to Wyoming said they'd never seen a man his size sit a horse so easy, or speak so little, or watch so much. He'd inherited 40,000 acres from a father who died young, and he ran it like a man who trusted work more than words. He ate breakfast in the cookhouse same as his hands, at the same long table, and for 6 years he had said perhaps 400 words total to his cook, mostly some variation of obliged and that'll do. The other hands liked to tell newcomers that Garrett Kincaid had buried 3 foremen's worth of opinions with a single look and never raised his voice once doing it. There was a story, told and retold around the bunkhouse stove until nobody could say for certain how much of it was true anymore, about a drover new to the outfit who'd made some remark about the cook's size within earshot of the branding pen, and how Garrett had simply stopped what he was doing, walked over, and stood in front of the man without a word until the man found somewhere else to be for the rest of the season. Hattie had never confirmed the story to anyone who asked, mostly because she had never actually witnessed it herself, but she noticed, without ever being able to say exactly when it started, that no hand on the Kincaid ranch ever spoke carelessly about her within her own hearing, or anyone else's. Hattie had made her peace with being unremarkable to him. He was not unkind. He was simply a man who ran 40,000 acres and did not spend his attention where it wasn't required. She fed him. He paid her wages on time and never questioned her books. That was the whole of it, she told herself, wiping flour from her hands on an apron, her belly rounded out at the front, no matter how she tied the strings, and she told herself she did not mind. What she minded, though nobody in Millbrook Flats knew it, was the letter that had come from the Ashby Trust and Savings Bank 3 weeks before, addressed to her mother, informing them that the note on the Sutter homestead, 6 acres and a 2-room cabin that had been her father's whole inheritance to give, would be called due in full come spring, on account of what the letter called irregular payment history, though Hattie had never once been late. She had read that letter at the kitchen table by lamplight, her mother's hands shaking around it, and she had understood immediately, without anyone telling her, exactly whose hand had guided it. Cornelius Ashby ran the only bank for 40 miles. His wife ran everything else. Lavinia Ashby had a daughter, Delia, 19, and lovely, in the practiced way of a girl, who had been told her whole life that loveliness was a kind of currency, and Lavinia had decided, with the flat certainty of a woman used to getting what she wanted, that Delia would marry Garrett Kincaid. It was not an unreasonable ambition on its face. The Kincaid ranch was the largest in the territory, and Garrett Kincaid, though he'd shown no interest in courting anyone in the 4 years since his father's death, was still unmarried, still young enough, still the finest match west of Denver. Lavinia had begun engineering opportunities all autumn, a supper here, a church social there, an invented reason for Delia to be delivered to the Kincaid gate with a basket of preserves. Garrett had been perfectly polite and utterly unmoved, which only made Lavinia more determined. The way a woman used to winning becomes more dangerous the moment she senses she might not. It did not occur to Lavinia Ashby, not once, that the obstacle in her path might be the wide, work-roughened woman standing over the stove in the cookhouse, because Lavinia had never once looked at Hattie Sutter long enough to consider her a person at all, let alone a rival. That was, in the end, her first mistake. Lavinia Ashby had married well herself, 30 years before, and had spent every year since improving on the arrangement by careful degrees. A larger house, a finer pew, a standing invitation to sit at the head table at every church supper in the county. She was not, by her own accounting, a cruel woman. She simply believed, with the total conviction of someone who had never once had to test the belief against her own suffering, that the world arranged itself properly when the properly arranged people were left to arrange it. Delia marrying the Kincaid ranch was not ambition to Lavinia's mind. It was correction, the fixing of an oversight, the largest fortune in the territory finally matched to the family Lavinia felt had always deserved it. She spoke of the match to her husband as though it were already settled, the way she spoke of most things she had decided, and Cornelius, who had learned the hard way that agreeing was cheaper than debating, nodded along and hoped, privately, that Garrett Kincaid proved as biddable as his wife assumed. The second Sunday of October, Hattie came out to the cookhouse woodpile before dawn, same as always, to find it already split, not carelessly, not by a hand in a hurry, but stacked square and even against the wall, kindling sorted from the heavier splits, everything dry and ready, as though someone had known exactly how she liked it arranged. She stood in the gray half-light with her breath fogging and looked at that woodpile for a long moment before she decided one of the hands must have done it out of some obligation she didn't understand, and she said nothing, and she was grateful anyway because her shoulders had been aching for a week from a cough that wouldn't leave her chest. The following Sunday it happened again, and the Sunday after that. 6 Sundays running, the wood was split and stacked before she ever reached the pile, always before first light, always done by someone who never once left a boot print close enough to the door to explain how they'd gotten in and out without waking her, though her cookhouse door creaked loud enough to wake the dead. She began to notice other small things, too. The water barrel by the door kept fuller than she filled it, a broken hinge on the flour bin repaired without a word. Once, unmistakably, a jar of wild honey set on her work table with no note at all. She asked cook's helper, a boy named Dobbs, if he knew who was doing it, and Dobbs shrugged and said he figured it was just ranch work getting done. Ma'am, same as always. The third Sunday, she tried staying up later than usual the night before, thinking she might catch whoever it was in the act, but she fell asleep at the kitchen table over her account books and woke to find the wood already done and a blanket, one of her own, from the cookhouse cot, laid over her shoulders that she had no memory of putting there herself. The fourth Sunday she left the door unbarred on purpose and lay awake listening, and heard, sometime before 4 in the morning, the particular sound of a heavy man trying very hard to move quietly, the creak of a boot sole finding uneven ground, the soft chunk of an axe biting wood, with the caution of someone determined not to wake her, and she lay still under her quilt and let herself wonder, for the length of that whole sound, who in the outfit was built large enough to make even careful footsteps carry that far. By the 5th Sunday she had begun leaving a plate of the previous night's cornbread on the chopping block, wrapped in a cloth, without ever writing a word to explain it, and by the 6th Sunday the cloth came back each week folded neat and returned to her windowsill, empty, and something about that small, silent exchange, wood for bread for nothing, week after week, had begun to feel less like a mystery she wanted solved, and more like a conversation she did not want to end. It was the 7th Sunday, near the end of November, when Hattie woke earlier than usual, roused by that same cough, and stepped out into the dark to find a shape at the woodpile she recognized instantly by its size alone, because there was only one man in the county built like a doorway. Garrett Kincaid straightened at the sound of her door, an axe loose in one hand, 6 weeks of frost-cold mornings written plainly on his face, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. "You've been doing this," she said. It was not a question. "Didn't want you asking," he said, which was as close to an admission as the man had ever offered anyone about anything. 6 weeks, Mr. Kincaid." "Your cough's been bad since September," he said, which answered nothing and everything at once, and set the axe against the woodpile and touched the brim of his hat, and walked back toward the main house in the dark before she could think of a single thing to say to a man who apparently noticed considerably more than 400 words worth. She did not tell anyone. She did not know, herself, what to make of it. A man who ran 40,000 acres, splitting her kindling in secret, before dawn for 6 weeks running, saying nothing, wanting nothing, only easing a burden she'd carried so long she'd stopped noticing its weight. She went back to her stove that morning and made his eggs the way he liked them, and when he came in for breakfast he said, "Obliged," same as every morning, and neither of them mentioned the woodpile, and something had shifted between them anyway, quiet as frost settling on a fence rail overnight. It became, after that morning, a kind of unspoken language between them. He never split the wood again in secret. There was no more secret to keep, but he began arriving at the cookhouse before the other hands most mornings, and he began asking her things he'd never asked in 6 years, how her mother's health was holding, whether the bank in town had been fair with her, whether she'd had word from her cousins back in Missouri. He was not a man who made conversation easily, and she watched him work at it the way a man works at a task he isn't skilled in but means to finish anyway, and she found she did not mind waiting through his long silences because when he finally spoke, he meant every word of it. She told him nothing of the Ashby letter. Some pride would not let her. The idea of Garrett Kincaid, the largest rancher in 3 counties, hearing that Hattie Sutter's mother might lose the only roof over her head, felt too much like asking for charity she had never once asked for in 6 years of standing over his stove. So she carried the letter's weight alone and did her books twice over at night, trying to find 6 weeks more payment, somewhere in numbers that had no more give in them, and said nothing. Lavinia Ashby, meanwhile, had begun to notice something she did not care for at all, that Garrett Kincaid had stopped attending the socials she arranged with such care, had sent his regrets to 2 suppers running, and had, according to the wife of the mercantile owner, been seen more than once riding out from the direction of the cookhouse at an hour no rancher needed to be riding anywhere. Lavinia was not a stupid woman, whatever else she was, and it took her only a single Sunday of careful inquiry to arrive at a conclusion that filled her with something closer to fury than she had felt in years, that the obstacle standing between her daughter and the largest ranch in the territory was, of all things, a cook. She did not confront Hattie directly. That was not Lavinia's way. Instead, she called upon Cornelius, quietly over supper, and reminded him, in the mild tone she used for her most dangerous ideas, that the note on a certain 6-acre homestead had been given considerable patience already, and that patience, in banking, was a resource that eventually ran out. Cornelius, who had learned decades ago that disagreeing with his wife cost more than it saved, said he supposed that was true, and the letter that followed 3 weeks later was the direct result of that supper, though Hattie would not learn the shape of that particular cruelty until much later. What Hattie did learn, on a cold Tuesday in early December, was that Lavinia Ashby had begun speaking of her openly, not by name always, but unmistakably, over porch teas and church suppers, remarks about women who forgot their place and reached above their station, and worst of all, the line about service and marrying that Hattie overheard at the well with her own ears, delivered with a smile to an audience that laughed a half-second too late because none of them were entirely sure it was safe not to. Hattie said nothing. She had spent her whole life being talked past, and she had built, over the years, a kind of quiet armor against it. She did not cry where anyone could see. She did not answer cruelty with cruelty. She went back to her stove and she cooked, because the work was the one thing in her life nobody could take credit for but her. But that night, alone in the cabin with her mother asleep in the next room and the Ashby letter still folded in the kitchen drawer, she allowed herself, for the first time in 6 years, to sit at the table and cry without anyone watching, because it is one thing to be overlooked and another thing entirely to be looked at only long enough to be mocked. She thought, sitting there, of all the small ways she had made herself smaller over the years without ever losing an ounce of size, how she'd learned to laugh along at socials when she was the joke, rather than let anyone see it landed, how she'd trained herself not to want the things other girls wanted, a dance, a compliment, a man's eye lingering a moment longer than necessary, because wanting those things and not receiving them hurt worse than never wanting them at all. She thought of her father, who used to tell her, back when she was a girl too big for her school dresses and too proud to say it bothered her, that a strong back was worth 10 pretty faces come harvest time, and she had believed him, had built a whole life on believing him, and had still, somehow, ended up crying alone at a kitchen table at 31 years old over a woman's smiling cruelty at a well. She did not know, that night, that a man built like a doorway had already begun, in his quiet way, to notice every part of what Lavinia Ashby had spent 30 years failing to see. Garrett found out about the bank letter by accident, the way most important things in Millbrook Flats eventually surfaced. Dobbs mentioned to another hand that Miss Sutter had been looking poorly worried since a letter came for her mother, and the hand mentioned it to the foreman, and the foreman, not knowing any better, mentioned it to Garrett over the branding fire, thinking it was simple ranch gossip worth passing along. Garrett said nothing in response, which the foreman took for disinterest, and rode into town himself the following morning before breakfast, which nobody thought unusual, because Garrett Kincaid rode into town often enough on ranch business. What he did in town that morning, he told no one, not even Hattie, not for weeks. He walked into the Ashby Trust and Savings Bank, asked to see the note on the Sutter homestead, and when Cornelius Ashby, flustered, uncertain how to refuse the largest depositor in the county anything, showed it to him, Garrett read the terms twice, said the payment history looked entirely regular to him, and asked, in a voice so quiet, Cornelius later said it frightened him more than shouting would have, exactly whose decision it had been to call the note early. Cornelius, sweating, said something about board discretion. Garrett said he understood board discretion could run in more than one direction and that he would be watching the matter closely, and left without raising his voice once. He did not pay off the note himself, not yet. Some instinct told him Hattie would not thank him for solving her troubles behind her back, and he was right about that, though he did not yet know how right. But he made certain in his quiet way that everyone at that bank understood the Sutter homestead now had the attention of the Kincaid ranch, which in Millbrook Flats was worth more than any signature. He wrestled, in the weeks that followed, with a decision that sat uneasily on a man used to solving problems with the plain application of resources he had in abundance. It would have been the simplest thing in the world for Garrett Kincaid to ride to the bank a second time and settle the Sutter note himself, in full, without ever telling Hattie until the deed was already done, and some part of him wanted exactly that, wanted to remove the trouble from her shoulders the way he'd been quietly removing the weight of Kindling from her mornings for weeks. But he had watched her long enough by then to understand something about her that Lavinia Ashby, in 30 years of looking past her, had never once bothered to learn. That Hattie Sutter's pride was not vanity, but the one possession poverty and hard labor had never managed to take from her, and that solving her troubles in secret, however well meant, would cost her something he had no right to take. So he waited, turning the problem over the way he turned over a difficult calving in late winter, patient and watchful, until the moment arrived to settle it in a way that let her keep what mattered, not just her home, but her say in the matter. That patience nearly failed him one gray afternoon in early December, when Dobbs mentioned in passing that Miss Sutter's mother had taken to her bed with worry over the note, unable to eat, certain the family would be turned out onto the road come the spring thaw. Garrett said nothing to Dobbs, but he rode out past the Sutter homestead that evening on some invented pretext about strayed cattle, and saw lamplight burning late in the little cabin's window, and understood, watching it, that whatever restraint he owed Hattie's pride, he was no longer willing to let this rest until the spring. The confrontation came, as these things do, in public, at the worst possible moment for Lavinia Ashby to have chosen it, though she did not know that yet. The occasion was the Founders' Day supper and dance, held every December in the town hall, the one night of the year when every rancher, banker, and hired hand in 3 counties crowded under the same roof to eat too much and dance badly and pretend, for one evening, that Millbrook Flats was one town instead of 100 small kingdoms. Hattie came because the whole ranch came, standing near the back by the coffee urns in her good gray dress, not dancing, because she never danced, watching instead the way she always watched, from just outside the center of things. Lavinia Ashby had planned the evening carefully. She had arranged for Cornelius to make a small, seemingly casual announcement near the end of supper about the bank's renewed confidence in certain accounts, timed precisely to coincide with Delia's arrival on Garrett's arm, an arm Lavinia had all but ordered her daughter to secure by whatever means available, and timed also, though this part she would later deny to her grave, to let it be known publicly and pointedly that the Sutter note remained in question, a small cruelty dressed as banking business, designed to remind the room exactly where Hattie Sutter stood in the order of things, in case anyone had confused a cook with anything more. It did not go as Lavinia planned. Garrett Kincaid did not take Delia's arm. He crossed the hall instead, and a man his size crossing a crowded room draws every eye in it whether he wishes it to or not, and stopped in front of the coffee urns, in front of Hattie, in front of 200 people who had known him their whole lives and had never once seen him choose to stand still in front of anyone. "Mrs. Ashby," he said, and his voice, quiet as it always was, carried anyway, the way a held breath carries in a silent room. "I understand there's some question about the Sutter note." A murmur went through the hall, the particular sound 200 people make when they realize they are about to witness something they will be repeating at breakfast tables for a decade. Delia Ashby, still standing where Garrett had left her near the punch table, went pale and then, to her credit, looked more relieved than wounded, as though some part of her had known for weeks this match was never going to take, and had simply been waiting for someone else to say so first. Cornelius went the color of ash. Lavinia's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes did. "A small matter of board discretion, Mr. Kincaid," she said. "Nothing that concerns." "It concerns me," Garrett said, "because I intend to pay it off myself, tonight, in full, and I intend the whole town to know it, so there's no more confusion about whether that note is a matter open for discretion." He did not look away from Lavinia as he said it, and the room had gone entirely silent, 200 people frozen over half-eaten supper plates. "But I want to say the rest of this in front of everyone too, so nobody spends another winter mistaking the truth." He turned, then, and looked at Hattie. Really looked. The way he had been looking for 6 weeks of Sunday mornings, nobody but the two of them had known about. And the crowd that had come to watch Delia Ashby secure the finest match in the territory watched instead as Garrett Kincaid took off his hat. "I've known Miss Sutter 6 years," he said. "In 6 years I've never once heard her complain about a burden, and I've never once seen her let a hungry man leave my table unfed. Drifter or drover, or banker's son, didn't matter to her. I've watched her carry weight most men in this room would set down and ask for help with, and carry it without asking anybody for a thing. She's the steadiest hand I know, and the most honest, and I have never in my life met anyone less likely to reach above her station, because Hattie Sutter never once acted like she had a station to reach above. If anybody in this hall was reaching above themselves tonight, it surely wasn't her." He paused, and the whole hall held its breath with him. "I'd like to marry her, if she'll have me. Not because of anything anybody's said about her tonight or any other night. Because she's the finest person I know, and I'd be a fool to spend one more winter pretending otherwise." Hattie stood very still through all of it, through the whole hall's held breath, and felt something loosen in her chest that had been drawn tight since she was a girl of 11, standing along a schoolhouse wall. She thought, in the strange, slow way a mind moves in moments too large to take in all at once, of every social she had stood along the edge of, every well she had drawn water from while someone's laughter carried across a yard at her expense. Every winter she had told herself a strong back was worth more than a kind word, because nobody was offering the kind word anyway. None of that, she realized, standing there, had ever been a fair trade. Not really. And it had taken a man built like a doorway, splitting wood in the dark for 6 weeks without asking for a word of thanks, to teach her that a woman could be seen for her steadiness and still, somehow, also be wanted. Hattie Sutter, who had not cried where anyone could see her in 6 years, stood by the coffee urns with 200 people watching and did not manage to hold to that record any longer, though these were not the tears anyone in that room had ever seen from her before. "Yes," she said, which was one word more than Garrett Kincaid usually needed, and considerably more than the room needed to erupt. Lavinia Ashby left the hall before the applause finished, Delia trailing behind her, and it would be some years yet before either of them spoke easily to anyone at the Kincaid ranch again, though Cornelius, to his credit, quietly ensured the Sutter note was marked paid in full the following morning, regardless of who ultimately settled it. The town of Millbrook Flats, for its part, spent the better part of that winter retelling the story of the Founder's Day supper with steadily increasing embellishment, until versions circulated in which Garrett Kincaid had supposedly lifted the coffee urn clean off the table in his fervor, or Lavinia Ashby had fainted dead away, neither of which had actually happened, though Hattie found she did not much mind the town finally having a story about her worth exaggerating, after a lifetime of having none at all. They were married in March, in the same town hall, a small ceremony by Kincaid Ranch standards, but the largest wedding Millbrook Flats had seen in a decade, because half the county turned out to see the cook and the giant get married, and nobody who'd been at the Founder's Day supper was inclined to miss the sequel. Hattie's mother, healthy enough by spring to stand for the whole ceremony, cried through all of it. Garrett wore a suit that fit him nowhere well, because no tailor in 3 counties had ever needed to make one his size before, and he did not seem to mind that either. Hattie wore a dress of deep blue wool that Dobbs's mother had sewn for her, let out twice at the seams before it fit right, and she stood at the front of that hall in it feeling, for the first time since she was a girl of 11, arriving in Millbrook Flats with a wagon full of thin winters behind her, entirely unashamed to be looked at by every person in the room. There was no cake, not the tiered kind city papers wrote about, but there was a table of pies 6 deep, because Hattie had insisted on baking her own wedding supper herself, over Garrett's mild objection, on the grounds that she had never once trusted anyone else's hands with a task that mattered to her, and she saw no reason a wedding ought to be different. The whole ranch crew came, and half the town besides, and even Cornelius Ashby showed his face for a quarter hour out of what Hattie privately suspected was guilt, though Lavinia and Delia stayed home. 5 years passed, the way 5 good years do, quickly and all at once. The Kincaid cookhouse, under Hattie's management, grew from a bunkhouse kitchen into the finest table in the territory, known clear to Denver for feeding any traveler who came hungry to its door, rancher or drifter, without ever asking what he could pay. Garrett built her a proper dining hall the 2nd year of their marriage, twice the size of the old cookhouse, and had a sign carved for the door that read simply, Sutter House, because he said a name earned over 6 years of unthanked labor ought to outlast the woman who earned it, being anybody's cook alone. Hattie ran it the way she ran everything, without complaint and without asking for help she didn't need. It was the 5th autumn of their marriage when a girl named Nora Prescott came looking for kitchen work, 16 and thin and overlooked in exactly the way Hattie remembered being overlooked once herself, an orphaned relation nobody in town quite wanted the trouble of, too plain for the mercantile, too quiet for the schoolhouse, turned away from 3 doors before she reached Sutter House. Hattie hired her on the spot, put her at the head of the bread table instead of the scrub bucket where 3 other households had kept her, and told her, the first morning, the only piece of advice she figured mattered, that the work would speak for her long before anybody else in this town thought to. Garrett still rose before dawn most mornings, some habits outlasting their original purpose, and more often than not Nora would find the kindling already split and stacked by the Sutter House door before she arrived to start the ovens, though nobody had asked him to do it in 5 years, and Hattie had long since stopped needing the help. When Nora asked why the rancher himself was out splitting wood before sunrise like a hired hand, Hattie only smiled and said, "Some men showed you how they felt about you long before they ever found the words for it, and that a woman ought to pay attention to the woodpile as much as she paid attention to what a man said at supper." Nora asked her once, that first autumn, whether she ever thought about Lavinia Ashby anymore, and Hattie considered the question honestly before answering, the way she considered most things. She said she supposed she thought of her sometimes, mostly without anger, because a woman who spent her whole life looking past people missed a great deal more than she ever took from anyone else, and there wasn't much satisfaction in begrudging somebody a loss that heavy. Then she handed Nora the bread paddle and told her to mind the oven, because supper for 30 hands didn't cook itself. Thanks or no thanks, notice or no notice, and there was work enough in a day to fill up all the room a grudge might otherwise have taken. Nobody had noticed Hattie Sutter for 6 long years. Not really, not until a giant of a man started splitting her kindling before dawn without asking for a single word of thanks. But that had never been the point of the story. Not truly. The point, as Hattie told Nora that first morning over a fresh batch of bread neither of them would ever let anyone go hungry for, was simpler than that. Nobody has to notice you for the work to be worth doing, and worth doing well, but it is a fine thing, all the same, when somebody finally does.